Chapters 31 through 33 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 31. A letter from Jack Glover arrived the next morning. He had had an easy journey, was glad to have had the opportunity of seeing Lydia, and hoped she would think over the will. Lydia was not thinking of wills, but of an excuse to get back to London. All of a sudden, the loveliness of Monte Carlo had palled upon her, and she had almost forgotten the circumstances which made the change of scene and climate so welcome. "Go back to London, my dear?" said Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, shocked. "What a rash notion! Why, it is freezing in town, and foggy, and I really can't let you go back." Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was agitated at the very thought. Her own good time on the Riviera depended upon Lydia's staying. Jean had made that point very clear. She explained to her discomforted hostess, was ready to go back at once, and the prolongation of Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's stay depended upon Lydia's plans. A startling switch of cause and effect, for Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had understood that Jean's will controlled the plans of the party. Lydia might have insisted, had she really known the reason for her sudden longing for the grimy metropolis, but she could not even convince herself that the charms of Monte Carlo were contingent upon the presence there of a man who had aroused her furious indignation, and with whom she had spent most of the time quarrelling. She mentioned her unrest to Jean, and Jean, as usual, seemed to understand. "The Riviera is rather like Turkish delight. Very sweet, but unsatisfying," she said. "Stay another week, and then if you feel that way, we'll all go home together." "This means breaking up your holiday," said Lydia in self-reproach. "Not a bit," denied the girl. "Perhaps I shall feel as you do in a week's time." A week? Jean thought that much might happen in a week. In truth, events began to move quickly from that night, but in a way she had not anticipated. Mr. Briggerland, who had been reading the newspaper through the conversation, looked up. "They are making a great fuss of this Moor in Nice," he said. "But if I remember rightly, Nice invariably has some weird lion to adore." "Muley Hafiz," said Lydia. "Yes, I saw him the day I went to lunch with Mr. Stepney. A fine-looking man." "I'm not greatly interested in natives," said Jean carelessly. "What is he, a Negro?" "Oh, no. He's fairer than—" Lydia was about to say your father, but thought it discreet to find another comparison. "He's fairer than most of the people in the south of France," she said. "But then, all very highly bred Moors aren't they?" Jean shook her head. "Ethnology means nothing to me," she said humorously. "I've got my idea of Moors from Shakespeare, and I thought they were mostly black. What is he, then? I haven't read the papers." "He is the pretender to the Moorish throne," said Lydia, "and there has been a lot of trouble in the French Senate about him. France supports his claims, and the Spaniards have offered a reward for his body, dead or alive, and that has brought about a strained relationship between Spain and France." Jean regarded her with an amused smile. "Fancy taking an interest in international politics. I suppose that is due to your working on a newspaper, Lydia." Jean discovered that she was to take greater interest in Muley Hafiz than she could have thought was possible. She had to go into Monte Carlo to do some shopping. Mentone was nearer, but she preferred the drive into the Principality. The rooms had no great call for her, and whilst Morden went to a garage to have a faulty cylinder examined, she strolled onto the terrace of the casino, down the broad steps towards the sea. The bathing huts were closed at this season, but the little road down to the beach is secluded, and had been a favorite walk of hers in earlier visits. Near the huts, she passed a group of dark-looking men in long white jalabs, and wondered which of these was the famous Muley. One, she noticed, with a particularly Negro type of face, wore on his flowing robe the scarlet ribbon of the Legion of Honor. Somehow or other, he did not seem interesting enough to be muley, she thought as she went on to a strip of beach. A man was standing on the seashore, a tall, commanding man, gazing out, it seemed, across the sunlit ocean, as though he were in search of something. He could not have heard her footfall because she was walking on the sand, and yet he must have realized her presence, for he turned, and she almost stopped at the sight of his face. He might have been a European. His complexion was fair, though his eyebrows and eyes were jet black, as also was the tiny beard and mustache he wore. Beneath the conventional jalab, he wore a dark green jacket, and she had a glimpse of glittering decorations before he pulled over his cloak so that they were hidden. But it was his eyes which held her. They were large and as black as night, and they were set in a face of such strength and dignity that Jean knew instinctively she was looking upon the Moorish pretender. They stood for a second, staring at one another, and then the Moor stepped aside. "Pardon," he said in French. "I am afraid I startled you." Jean was breathing a little quicker. She could not remember in her life any man who had created so immediate and favorable an impression. She forgot her contempt for native people, forgot his race, his religion, and religion was a big thing to Jean, forgot everything except that behind those eyes she recognized something which was kin to her. "You are English, of course," he said in that language. "Scottish," smiled Jean. "It is almost the same, isn't it?" He spoke without any trace of an accent, without an error of grammar, and his voice was the voice of a college man. He had left the way open for her to pass on, but she lingered. "You are Muley Hafiz, aren't you?" she asked, and he turned his head. "I've read a great deal about you," she added, though in truth she had read nothing. He laughed, showing 2 rows of perfect white teeth. It was only by contrast with their whiteness that she noticed the golden brown of his complexion. "I am of international interest," he said lightly, and glanced round toward his attendants. She thought he was going, and would have moved on, but he stopped her. "You are the first English-speaking person I have talked to since I've been in France," he said, "except the American ambassador." He smiled at a pleasant recollection. "You talk almost like an Englishman yourself." "I was at Oxford," he said. "My brother was at Harvard. My father, the brother of the late Sultan, was a very progressive man, and believed in the Western education for his children. Won't you sit down?" he asked, pointing to the sand. She hesitated a second, and then sank to the ground, and crossing his legs, he sat by her. "I was in France for 4 years," he carried on, evidently anxious to hold her in conversation. "So I speak both languages fairly well. Do you speak Arabic?" He asked the question solemnly, but his eyes were bright with laughter. "Not very well," she answered gravely. "Are you staying very long?" It was a conventional question, and she was unprepared for the reply. "I leave tonight," he said, "though very few people know it. You have surprised a state secret." He smiled again, and then he began to talk of Morocco and its history, and with extraordinary ease he traced the story of the families which had ruled that troubled state. He touched lightly on his own share in the rebellion, which had almost brought about a European war. "My uncle seized the throne, you know," he said, taking up a handful of sand and tossing it up in the air. "He defeated my father and killed him, and then we caught his 2 sons." "What happened to them?" asked Jean curiously. "Oh, we killed them," he said carelessly. "I had them hanged in front of my tent. You're shocked?" She shook her head. "Do you believe in killing your enemies?" She nodded. "Why not? It's the only logical thing to do." "My brother joined forces with the present sultan, and if I ever catch him, I shall hang him too." He smiled. "And if he catches you?" she asked. "Why, he'll hang me," he laughed. "That is the rule of the game." "How strange," she said, half to herself. "Do you think so? I suppose from the European standpoint." No, no, she stopped him. I wasn't thinking of that. You are logical, and you do the logical thing. That is how I would treat my enemies. If you had any, he suggested. She nodded. If I had any, she repeated with a hard little smile. Will you tell me this? Do I call you Mr. Muley or Lord Muley? You may call me Wazir, if you're so hard up for a title, he said, and the little idiom sounded queer from him. Well, Wazir, will you tell me, suppose somebody who had something that you wanted very badly and they wouldn't give it to you, and you had the power to destroy them, what would you do? I should certainly destroy them, said Muley Hafiz. It is unnecessary to ask. The common rule, the simple plan, he quoted. Her eyes were fixed on his face, and she was frowning, though this she did not know. I'm glad I met you this afternoon, she said. It must be wonderful living in that atmosphere, the atmosphere of might and power, where men and women aren't governed by the finicking rules which vitiate the Western world. He laughed. Then you are tired of your Western civilization, he said as he rose and helped her to her feet. His hands were long and delicate, and she grew breathless at the touch of them. You must come along to my little city in the hills, where the law is the sword of Muley Hafiz. She looked at him a moment. I almost wish I could, she said, and held out her hand. He took it in the European fashion and bowed over it. She seemed so tiny a thing by the side of him. Her head did not reach his shoulder. Goodbye, she said hurriedly, and turning, walked back the way she had come, and he stood watching her until she was out of sight. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32. Jean? She looked around to meet the scowling gaze of Marcus Stepney. I must say, you're the limit, he said violently. There are lots of things I imagine you do, but to stand there in broad daylight talking to a nigger. If I stand in broad daylight and talk to a card sharper, Marcus, I think I'm just low enough to do almost anything. A damned Moorish nigger, he spluttered, and her eyes narrowed. Walk up the road with me, and if you possibly can, keep your voice down to the level which gentlemen usually employ when talking to women, she said. She was in better condition than he, and he was a little out of breath by the time they reached the Café de Paris, which was crowded at that hour with the afternoon tea people. He found a quiet corner, and by this time his anger, and a little of his courage, had evaporated. I've only your best interest at heart, Jean, he said almost pleadingly. But you don't want people in our set to know you've been hobnobbing with this infernal Moor. When you say our set, to which set are you referring? She asked unpleasantly. Because, if it is the set I believe you mean, they can't think too badly of me for my liking. It would be degradation for me to be admired by your set, Marcus. Oh, come on now, he began feebly. I thought I had made it clear to you, and I hoped you would carry the marks to your dying day. There was malice in her voice, and he winced. That I do not allow you to dominate my life or to censor my actions. The nigger you referred to was more of a gentleman than you can ever be, Marcus, because he has breed, which the Lord didn't give you. The waiter brought the tea at that moment, and the conversation passed to unimportant topics until he had gone. I'm rather rattled, he apologized. I lost 6,000 louis last night. Then you have 6,000 reasons why you should keep on good terms with me, said Jean, smiling cheerfully. That caveman stuff? He asked and shook his head. She'd raise Cain. Jean was laughing inside herself, but she did not show her merriment. You can but try, she said. I've already told you how it can be done. I'll try tomorrow, he said after a thought. By heavens, I'll try tomorrow. It was on the tip of her tongue to say, not tomorrow, but she checked herself. Morden came round with the car to pick her up soon after. Morden! Her little chin jerked up with a gesture of annoyance, which she seldom permitted herself. And yet she felt unusually cheered. Her meeting with the Moor was a milestone in her life, from which memory she could draw both encouragement and comfort. "You met Muley?" said Lydia. "How thrilling! What is he like, Jean? Was he a blackamoor?"
"No, he wasn't a blackamoor," said the girl quietly. "He was an unusually intelligent man."
"Humph!" grunted her father. "How'd you come to meet him, my dear?"
"I picked him up on the beach," said Jean coolly, "as any flapper would pick up any nut."
Mr. Briggerland choked. "I hate to hear you talking like that, Jean. Who introduced him?"
"I told you," she said complacently. "I introduced myself. I talked to him on the beach, and he talked to me, and we sat down and played with the sand and discussed one another's lives."
"But how enterprising of you, Jean," said the admiring Lydia. Mr. Briggerland was going to say something, but he thought better of it. There was a concert at the theater that night, and the whole party went. They had a box, and the interval had come before Lydia saw somebody ushered into a box on the other side of the house, with such evidence of deference that she would have known who he was even if she had not seen the scarlet fez and the white robe. "It is your Muley," she whispered. Jean looked round. Muley Hafiz was looking across at her. His eyes immediately sought the girl's, and he bowed slightly. "What the devil is he bowing at?" grumbled Mr. Briggerland. "You didn't take any notice of him, did you, Jean?"
"I bowed to him," said his daughter, not troubling to look round. "Don't be silly, father. Anyway, if he weren't nice, it would be quite the right thing to do. I am the most distinguished woman in the house because I know Muley Hafiz, and he has bowed to me. Don't you realize that the social value of a lion's recognition?" Lydia could not see him distinctly. She had an impression of a white face, 2 large black spaces where his eyes were, and a black beard. He sat all the time in the shadow of a curtain. Jean looked round to see if Marcus Stepney was present, hoping that he had witnessed the exchange of courtesies. But Marcus at that moment was watching little bundles of 12,000-franc notes raked across the croupier's end of the table, which is the business end of Monte Carlo. Jean was the last to leave the car when it set them down at the Villa Casa. Mordaunt called her respectfully. "Excuse me, mademoiselle," he said. "I wish you would come to the garage and see the new tires that have arrived. I don't like them." It was a code which she had agreed he should use when he wanted her. "Very good, Mordaunt. I will come to the garage later," she said carelessly. "What does Mordaunt want you for?" asked her father with a frown. "You heard him. He doesn't approve of some new tires that have been brought for the car," she said coolly. "And don't ask me questions. I've got a headache, and I'm dying for a cup of chocolate." "If that fella gives you any trouble, he'll be sorry," said Briggerland. "And let me tell you this, Jean, that marriage idea of yours—" She only looked at him, but he knew the look and wilted. "I don't want to interfere with your private affairs," he mumbled, "but the very thought of it gets me crazy." The garage was a brick building erected by the side of the carriage drive, built much nearer the house than is usually the case. Jean waited a reasonable time before she slipped away. Mordaunt was waiting for her before the open doors of the garage. The place was in darkness, and she did not see him standing in the entrance until she was within a few paces of the man. "Come up to my room," he said briskly. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to speak to you, and this is not the place." "This is the only place where I am prepared to speak to you at the moment, Francis," she said reproachfully. "Don't you realize that my father is within hearing, and at any moment Madame Meredith may come out? How would I explain my presence in your room?" He did not answer for a moment. Then, "Jean, I'm worried," he said in a troubled voice. "I cannot understand your plans. They are too clever for me, and I have known men and women of great attainment. The great Bersac—" "The great Bersac is dead," she said coldly. "He was a man of such great attainments that he came to the knife. Besides, it is not necessary that you should understand my plans, Frances.
She knew quite well what was troubling him, but she waited. "I cannot understand the letter which I wrote for you," said Mordaunt. "The letter in which I say Madame Meredith loved me. I have thought this matter out, Jean, and it seems to me that I am compromised." She laughed softly.
"Poor Frances," she said mockingly. "With whom could you be compromised but with your future wife? If I desire you to write that letter, what else matters?"
Again he was silent. "I cannot speak here," he said almost roughly. "You must come to my room." She hesitated. There was something in his voice she did not like.
"Very well,"
she said, and followed him up the steep stairs. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33. "Now explain." His words were a command, his tone peremptory. Jean, who knew men and read them without error, realized that this was not a moment to temporize.
"I will explain to you, Frances, but I do not like the way you speak," she said. "It is not you I wish to compromise, but Madame Meredith."
"In the letter I wrote you, I said I was going away. I confessed that I had forged a cheque for 5,000,000 francs. That is a very serious document, mademoiselle, to be in the possession of anybody but myself." He looked at her straight in the eyes, and she met his gaze unflinchingly.
"The thing will be made very clear to you tomorrow, Frances," she said softly. "And really there is no reason to worry. I wish to end this unhappy state of affairs."
"With me?" he asked quickly.
"No, with Madame Meredith," she answered. "I, too, am tired of waiting for marriage, and I intend asking my father's permission for the wedding to take place next week. Indeed, Frances," she lowered her eyes modestly, "I have already written to the British consul at Nice, asking him to arrange the ceremony to be performed."
The sallow face of the chauffeur flashed a dull red. "Do you mean that?" he asked eagerly. "Jean, you are not deceiving me."
She shook her head. "No, Frances," she said in that low, plaintive voice of hers. "I could not deceive you in a matter so important to myself."
He stood watching her, his breast heaving, his eyes devouring her. Then, "You will give me back that letter I wrote, Jean?" he said.
"I will give it to you tomorrow."
"Tonight," he said, and he took both her hands in his. "I am sure I am right. It is too dangerous a letter to be in existence, Jean. Dangerous for you and me. You will let me have it tonight?" She hesitated.
"It is in my room,"
she said, an unnecessary statement, and in the circumstances a dangerous one, for his eyes dropped to the bag that hung at her wrist. "It is there," he said. "Jean, darling, do as I ask," he pleaded. "You know, every time I think of that letter, I go cold. I was a madman when I wrote it."
"I have not got it here," she said steadily.
She tried to draw back, but it was too late. He gripped her wrists and pulled the bag roughly from her hand. "Forgive me, but I know I am right," he began, and then like a fury she flew at him, wrenched the bag from his hand, and by the very violence of her attack flung him backward. He stared at her, and the color faded from his face, leaving it a dead white. "What is this you are trying to do?" he glowered at her.
"I will see you in the morning, Frances,"
she said, and turned. Before she could reach the head of the stairs, his arm was around her, and he had dragged her back. "My friend," he said between his teeth, "there is something in this matter which is bad for me."
"Let me go,"
she breathed, and struck at his face. For a full minute they struggled, and then the door opened, and Mr. Briggerland came in, and at the sight of his livid face, Mordaunt released his hold. "You swine!" hissed the big man. His fist shot out, and Mordaunt went down with a crash to the ground. For a moment he was stunned, and then with a snarl he turned over on his side and whipped a revolver from his hip pocket. Before he could fire, the girl had gripped the pistol and wrenched it from his hand. "Get up!" said Briggerland sternly. "Now explain to me, my friend, what you mean by this disgraceful attack upon Mademoiselle." The man rose and dusted himself mechanically, and there was that in his face which boded no good to Mr. Briggerland. Before he could speak, Jean intervened. "Father," she said quietly, "you have no right to strike Francis." "Francis!" spluttered Briggerland, his face dark purple with rage. "Francis," she repeated calmly, "it is right that you should know that Francis and I will be married next week." Mr. Briggerland's jaw dropped. "What?" he almost shrieked. She nodded. "We are going to be married next week," she said, "and the little scene you witnessed has nothing whatever to do with you." The effect of these words on Morden was magical. The malignant frown which had distorted his face cleared away. He looked from Jean to Briggerland, as though it were impossible to believe the evidence of his ears. "Francis and I love one another," Jean went on in her even voice. "We have quarreled tonight on a matter which has nothing to do with anybody save ourselves." "You're going to marry him next week?" said Mr. Briggerland dully. "By God, you'll do nothing of the sort." She raised her hand. "It is too late for you to interfere, Father," she said quietly. "Francis and I shall go our way and face our own fate. I'm sorry you disapprove, because you have always been a very loving father to me." That was the first hint Mr. Briggerland had received that there might be some other explanation for her words, and he became calmer. "Very well," he said. "I can only tell you that I strongly disapprove of the action you have taken, and that I shall do nothing whatever to further your reckless scheme. But I must insist upon your coming back to the house now. I cannot have my daughter talked about." She nodded. "I will see you tomorrow morning early, Francis," she said. "Perhaps you will drive me into Nice before breakfast. I have some purchases to make." He bowed and reached out his hand for the revolver which she had taken from him. She looked at the ornate weapon, its silver-plated metal parts, the graceful ivory handle. "I'm not going to trust you with this tonight," she said with her rare smile. "Good night, Francis." He took her hand and kissed it. "Good night, Jean," he said in a tremulous voice. For a moment their eyes met, and then she turned as though she dared not trust herself, and followed her father down the stairs. They were halfway to the house when she laid her hand on Briggerland's arm. "Keep this," she said. It was Francis's revolver. "It is probably loaded, and I thought I saw some silver initials inlaid in the ivory handle. If I know Francis Morden, they are his." "What do you want me to do with it?" he said as she slipped the weapon into his pocket. She laughed. "On your way to bed, come in my room," she said. "I've got quite a lot to tell you." And she sailed into the drawing-room to interrupt Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, who was teaching a weary Lydia the elements of Bezique. "Where have you been, Jean?" asked Lydia, putting down her cards. "I've been arranging a novel experience for you, but I'm not so sure that it will be as interesting as it might. It all depends upon the state of your young heart," said Jean, pulling up a chair. "My young heart is very healthy," laughed Lydia. "What is the interesting experience?" "Are you in love?" challenged Jean, searching in a big bag where she kept her handiwork for a piece of unfinished sewing. Jean's domesticity was always a source of wonder to Lydia. "In love? Good heavens, no." "So much the better," nodded Jean. "That sounds as though the experience will be fascinating." She waited until she had threaded the fine needle before she explained. "If you really are not in love, and you sit on the lover's chair, the name of your future husband will come to you. If you're in love, of course, that complicates matters a little." "But suppose I don't want to know the name of my future husband?" "Then you're inhuman," said Jean. "Where is this magical chair?" "It is on the San Remo road beyond the frontier station. You've been there, haven't you, Margaret?" "Once," said Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, who had not been to the east of Cap Martin, but whose rule it was to never admit that she had missed anything worth seeing.
"It's a wild, eerie spot," Jean went on, "and miles from any human habitation."
"Are you going to take me?" Jean shook her head.
"That would ruin the spell," she said solemnly. "No, my dear, if you want that thrill, and seriously, it is worthwhile, because the scenery is the most beautiful of any along the coast, then you must go alone."
Lydia nodded. "I'll try it. Is it too far to walk?"
"Much too far," said Jean. "Morden will drive you out. He knows the road very well, and you ought not to take anybody but an experienced driver. I have a permit for the car to pass the frontier. You will probably meet Father in San Remo. He is taking a motorcycle trip. Aren't you, Daddy?"
Mr. Briggerland drew a long breath and nodded. He was beginning to understand. End of chapter 33. Chapters 34 and 35 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 34. There was lying in Monaco harbor a long white boat with a stumpy mast, which delighted in the name of Jungle Queen. It was the property of an impecunious English nobleman who made a respectable income from letting the vessel on hire. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had seemed surprised at the reasonable fee demanded for 2 months' use, until she had seen the boat the day after her arrival at Cap Martin. She had pictured a large and commodious yacht, yet she found a reasonably sized motor launch with a whale-deck cabin. The description in the agent's catalog that the Jungle Queen would sleep 4 was probably based on the experience of a party of young roisterers who had once hired the vessel. Supposing that the 4 were reasonably drunk or heavily drugged, it was possible for them to sleep on board the Jungle Queen. Normally, 2 persons have found it difficult, though by laying diagonally across the cabin, one small man could have slumbered without discomfort. The Jungle Queen had been a disappointment to Jean also. Her busy brain had conceived an excellent way of solving her principal problem, but a glance at the Jungle Queen told her that the money she had spent on hiring the launch, and it was little better, was wasted. She herself hated the sea, and had so little faith in the utility of the boat that she had even dismissed the youth who attended to its well-worn engines. Mr. Marcus Stepney, who was mildly interested in motorboating and considerably interested in any form of amusement which he could get at someone else's expense, had so far been the sole patron of the Jungle Queen. It was his practice to take the boat out every morning for a 2-hour sail, generally alone, though sometimes he would take somebody whose acquaintance he had made, and who was destined to be a source of profit to him in the future. Jean's talk of the caveman method of wooing had made a big impression upon him, emphasized as it had been, and still was, by the 2 angry red scars across the back of his hand. Things were not going well with him. The supply of rich and trusting youths had suddenly dried up. The little games in his private sitting room had dwindled to feeble proportions. He was still able to eke out a living, but his success at his private séances had been counterbalanced by the heavy losses at the public tables. It is a known fact that people who live outside the law keep to their own plane. The swindler very rarely commits acts of violence. The burglar who practices card sharping as a sideline is virtually unknown. Mr. Stepney lived on a plausible tongue and a pair of highly dexterous hands. It had never occurred to him to go beyond his own sphere, and indeed violence was as repugnant to him as it was vulgar. Yet the caveman's suggestion appealed to him. He had a way with women of a certain kind, and if his confidence had been rather shaken by Jean's savagery and Lydia's indifference, he had not altogether abandoned the hope that both girls in their turn might be conquered by the adoption of the right method. The method for dealing with Jean he had at the back of his mind. As for Lydia, Jean's suggestion was very attractive. It was after a very heavily unprofitable night spent at the Nice casino that he took his courage in both hands and drove to the Villa Casa. He was an early arrival, but Lydia had already finished her breakfast, and she was painfully surprised to see him. "I'm not swimming today, Mr. Stepney," she said, "and you don't look as if you were either." He was dressed in perfectly fitting white duck trousers, white shoes, and a blue nautical coat with brass buttons. A yachtsman's cap was set at an angle on his dark head. "No, I'm going out to do a little fishing," he said, "and I was wondering whether, in your charity, you would accompany me." She shook her head. "I'm sorry, I have another engagement this morning," she said. "Can you break it?" he pleaded. "As an especial favor to me? I've made all the preparations, and I've got a lovely lunch on board. You said you would come fishing with me one day." "I'd like to," she confessed, "but I really have something very important to do this morning." She did not tell him that her important duty was to sit on the lover's chair. Somehow her trip seemed just a little silly in the cold, clear light of the morning. "I could have you back in time," he begged. "Do come along, Mrs. Meredith. You're going to spoil my day." "I'm sure Lydia wouldn't be so unkind." Jean had made her appearance as they were speaking. "What is the scheme, Lydia?" "Mr. Stepney wants me to go out in the yacht," said the girl, and Jean smiled. "I'm glad you call it a yacht," she said dryly. "You're the second person who has so described it. The first was the agent. Take her tomorrow, Marcus." There was a glint of amusement in her eyes, and he felt that she knew what was at the back of his mind. "All right," he said in a tone which suggested that it was anything but all right, and added, "I saw you flying through Nice this morning with that yellow-faced chauffeur of yours, Jean." "Were you up so early?" she asked carelessly. "I wasn't dressed. I was looking out of the window. My room faces the Promenade des Anglais. I don't like that fellow." "I shouldn't let him know," said Jean coolly. "He's very sensitive. There are so many fellows that you dislike, too." "I don't think you ought to allow him so much freedom," Marcus Stepney went on. He was not in an amiable frame of mind, and the knowledge that he was annoying the girl encouraged him. "If you give these French chauffeurs an inch, they'll take a kilometre." "I suppose they would," said Jean thoughtfully. "How is your poor hand, Marcus?" He growled something under his breath, and thrust his hand deep into the pocket of his reefer coat. "It is quite well," he snapped, and went back to Monaco and his solitary boat trip, flaming. "One of these days," he muttered as he tuned up the motor. He did not finish his sentence, but sent the nose of the Jungle Queen at full speed for the open sea. Jean's talk with Morden that morning had not been wholly satisfactory. She had calmed his suspicions to an extent, but he still harped upon the letter, and she had promised to give it to him that evening. "My dear," she said, "you are too impulsive, too Gallic. I had a terrible scene with my father last night. He wants me to break off the engagement, told me what my friends in London would say, and how I should be a social outcast." And you, Jean?" he asked. "I told him that such things did not trouble me," she said, and her lips drooped sadly. "I know I cannot be happy with anybody but you, Francis, and I am willing to face the sneers of London, even the hatred and scorn of my father, for your sake." He would have seized her hand, though they were in the open road, but she drew away from him. "Be careful, Francis," she warned him. "Remember that you have a very little time to wait." "I cannot believe my good fortune," he babbled, as he brought the car up the gentle incline to Monte Carlo. He dodged an early morning tram, missing an unsuspecting passenger who had come around back of the tram car by inches and set the big Italia up the Palm Avenue into the town. "It is incredible, and yet I always thought some great thing would happen to me. And, Jean, I have risked so much for you. I would have killed Madame in London if she had not been dragged out of the way by that old man, and I did not watch for you and the man Meredith."
"Hush," she said in a low voice. "Let us talk about something else."
"Shall I see your father? I am sorry for what I did last night," he said when they were nearing the villa.
"Father has taken his motor bicycle and gone for a trip into Italy," she said. "No, I do not think I should speak to him, even if he were here. He may come around in time, Frances. You can understand that this is terribly distressing. He hoped I would make a great marriage. You must allow for father's disappointment."
He nodded. He did not drive her to the house, but stopped outside the garage.
"Remember, at 10:30 you will take Madame Meredith to the Lover's Chair. You know the place?"
"I know it very well," he said. "It is a difficult place to turn. I must take her almost into San Remo. Why does she want to go to the Lover's Chair? I thought only the cheap people went there."
"You must not tell her that," she said sharply. "Besides, I myself have been there."
"And who did you think of, Jean?" he asked suddenly. She lowered her eyes.
"I will not tell you now," she said, and ran into the house.
Frances stood gazing after her until she had disappeared, and then, like a man waking from a trance, he turned to the mundane business of filling his tank. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35. Lydia was dressing for her journey when Mrs. Cole-Mortimer came into the saloon where Jean was writing.
"There's a telephone call from Monte Carlo," she said. "Somebody wants to speak to Lydia."
Jean jumped up.
"I'll answer it," she said.
The voice at the other end of the wire was harsh and unfamiliar to her. "I want to speak to Mrs. Meredith."
"Who is it?"
asked Jean. "It is a friend of hers," said the voice. "Will you tell her? The business is rather urgent."
"I'm sorry," said Jean, "but she's just gone out."
She heard an exclamation of annoyance. "Do you know where she's gone?" asked the voice.
"I think she's gone into Monte Carlo," said Jean.
"If I miss her, will you tell her not to go out again until I come to the house?"
"Certainly," said Jean politely, and hung up the telephone.
"Was that a call for me?" It was Lydia's voice from the head of the stairs.
"Yes, dear. I think it was Marcus Stepney who wanted to speak to you. I told him you'd gone out," said Jean. "You didn't wish to speak to him?"
"Good heavens, no," said Lydia. "You are sure you won't come with me?"
"I'd rather stay here," said Jean truthfully.
The car was at the door, and Morden, looking unusually spruce in his white dust coat, stood by the open door. "How long shall I be away?" asked Lydia.
"About 2 hours, dear. You'll be very hungry when you come back," said Jean, kissing her. "Now, mind you think of the right man," she warned her in mockery.
"I wonder if I shall," said Lydia quietly. Jean watched the car out of sight, and then went back to the saloon. She was hardly seated before the telephone rang again, and she anticipated Mrs. Cole-Mortimer and answered it. "Mrs. Meredith has not gone into Monte Carlo," said the voice. "Her car has not been seen on the road."
"Is that Mr. Jaggs?"
asked Jean sweetly. "Yes, miss," was the reply.
"Mrs. Meredith has come back now. I'm dreadfully sorry. I thought she had gone into Monte Carlo. She's in her room with a bad headache. Will you come and see her?"
There was an interval of silence. "Yes, I will come," said Jaggs. 20 minutes later a taxicab set down the old man at the door, and a maid admitted him and brought him into the saloon. Jean rose to meet him. She looked at the bowed figure of old Jaggs, took him all in, from his iron gray hair to his dusty shoes, and then she pointed to a chair. "Sit down," she said, and old Jaggs obeyed. "You've something very important to tell Mrs. Meredith, I suppose?" "I will tell her that myself, miss," said the old man gruffly. "Well, before you tell her anything, I want to make a confession." She smiled down on old Jaggs and pulled up a chair so that she faced him. He was sitting with his back to the light, holding his battered hat on his knees.
I've brought you up under false pretenses, she said, because Mrs. Meredith isn't here at all.
Not here, he said, half rising.
No, she's gone for a ride with our chauffeur. But I wanted to see you, Mr. Jaggs, because... She paused. I realize that you're a dear friend of hers and have her best interest at heart. I don't know who you are, she said, shaking her head, but I know, of course, that Mr. John Glover has employed you.
What's this all about? He asked gruffly. What have you to tell me?
I don't know how to begin, she said, biting her lips. It is such a delicate matter that I hate talking about it at all. But the attitude of Mrs. Meredith to our chauffeur, Morden, is distressing, and I think Mr. Glover should be told.
He did not speak, and she went on.
These things do happen, I know, she said, but I am happy to say that nothing of that sort has come into my experience. And, of course, Morden is a good-looking man, and she is young.
What are you talking about? His tone was dictatorial and commanding.
I mean, she said, that I fear poor Lydia is in love with Morden.
He sprang to his feet. It's a damned lie, he said, and she stared at him. Now tell me what has happened to Lydia Meredith, he went on, and let me tell you this, Jean Briggerland, that if one hair of that girl's head is harmed, I will finish the work I began out there, he pointed to the garden, and strangle you with my own hands. She lifted her eyes to his and dropped them again and began to tremble. Then turning suddenly on her heel, she fled to her room, locked the door, and stood against it, white and shaking. For the second time in her life, Jean Briggerland was afraid. She heard his quick footsteps in the passage outside, and there came a tap on her door. "Let me in," growled the man, and for a second she almost lost control of herself. She looked wildly around the room for some way of escape, and then, as a thought struck her, she ran quickly into the bathroom, which opened from her room. A large sponge was set to dry by an open window, and this she seized. On a shelf by the side of the bath was a big bottle of ammonia, and, averting her face, she poured its contents upon the sponge until it was sodden. Then, with the dripping sponge in her hand, she crept back, turned the key, and opened the door. The old man burst in. Then, before he realized what was happening, the sponge was pressed against his face. The pungent drug almost blinded him. Its paralyzing fumes brought him on his knees. He gripped her wrist and tried to press away her hand, but now her arm was round his neck, and he could not get the purchase. With a groan of agony, he collapsed on the floor. In that instant, she was on him like a cat, her knee between his shoulders. Half unconscious, he felt his hands drawn to his back, and felt something lashing them together. She was using the silk girdle which had been about her waist, and her work was effective. Presently, she turned him over on his back. The ammonia was still in his eyes, and he could not open them. The agony was terrible, almost unendurable. With her hand under his arm, he struggled to his feet. He felt her lead him somewhere, and suddenly he was pushed into a chair. She left him alone for a little while, but presently came back and began to tie his feet together. It was a most amazing single-handed capture. Even Jean could never have imagined the ease with which she could gain her victory. "I'm sorry to hurt an old man." There was a sneer in her voice which he had not heard before. "But if you promise not to shout, I will not gag you." He heard the sound of running water, and presently, with a wet cloth, she began wiping his eyes gently. "You will be able to see in a minute," said Jean's cool voice. "In the meantime, you'll stay here until I send for the police." For all his pain, he was forced to chuckle. "Until you send for the police, eh? You know me." "I only know you're a wicked old man who broke into this house whilst I was alone and the servants were out," she said. "You know why I've come," he insisted. "I've come to tell Mrs. Meredith that 100,000 pounds have been taken from her bank on a forged signature." "How absurd," said Jean. She was sitting on the edge of the bath, looking at the bedraggled figure.
How could anybody draw money from Mrs. Meredith's bank whilst her dear friend and guardian Jack Glover is in London to see that she is not robbed?
Old Jaggs glared up at her from his inflamed eyes. "You know very well," he said distinctly, "that I am Jack Glover, and that I have not left Monte Carlo since Lydia Meredith arrived." End of chapter 35. Chapters 36 and 37 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 36. Mr. Briggerland did not enthuse over any form of sport or exercise. His hobbies were confined to the handsome motorcycle, which not only provided him with recreation, but had, on occasion, been of assistance in the carrying out of important plans formulated by his daughter. He stopped at Mentone for breakfast, and climbed the hill to Grimaldi after passing the frontier station at Pont St. Louis. He had all the morning before him, and there was no great hurry. At Ventimiglia he had a second breakfast, for the morning was keen, and his appetite was good. He loafed through the little town, with a cigar between his teeth, bought some curios at a shop, and continued his leisurely journey. His objective was San Remo. There was a train at 1 o'clock, which would bring him and his machine back to Monte Carlo, where it was his intention to spend the remainder of the afternoon. At Pont St. Louis he had had a talk with the customs officer. "No, monsieur, there are very few travellers on the road in the morning," said the official. "It is not until late in the afternoon that traffic begins. Times have changed on the Riviera, and so many people go to Cannes. The old road is now almost deserted." At 11 o'clock, Mr. Briggerland came to a certain part of the road and found a hiding place for his motorcycle, a small plantation of olive trees on the hillside. Incidentally, it was an admirable resting place, for from here he commanded an extensive view of the western road. Lydia's journey had been no less enjoyable. She, too, had stopped at Mentone to explore the town, and had left Pont St. Louis an hour after Mr. Briggerland had passed. The road to San Remo runs under the shadow of steep hills, through a bleak stretch of country, from which even the industrious peasantry of northern Italy cannot win a livelihood. Save for isolated patches of cultivated land, the hills are bare and menacing. With these gaunt plateaus on one side, and the rock-strewn seashore on the other, there was little to hold the eye, save an occasional glimpse of the Italian town in the far distance. There was a wild uncouthness about the scenery, which awed the girl. Sometimes the car would be running so near the sea level that the spray of the waves hit the windows. Sometimes it would climb over an out-jutting headland, and she would look down upon a bouldered beach 100 feet below. It was on the crest of a headland that the car stopped. Here the road ran out in a semicircle, so that from where she sat she could not see its continuation either before or behind. Ahead, it slipped around the shoulder of a high and overhanging mass of rock, through which the road must have been cut. Behind, it dipped down to a cove, hidden from sight. "There is the lover's chair, mademoiselle," said Morden. Half a dozen feet beneath the road level was a broad shelf of rock. A few stone steps led down, and she followed them. The lover's chair was carved in the face of the rock, and she sat down to view the beauty of the scene. The solitude, the stillness which only the lazy waves broke, the majesty of the setting, brought a strange peace to her. Beyond the edge of the ledge of the cliff fell sheer to the water, and she shivered as she stepped back from her inspection. Morton did not see her go. He sat on the running board of his car, his pale face between his hands, to pray his own gloomy thoughts. There must be a development, he told himself. He was beginning to get uneasy, and for the first time he doubted the sincerity of the woman who had been to him as a goddess. He did not hear Mr. Briggerland, for the dark man was light of foot when he came around the shoulder of the hill. Morden's back was toward him. Suddenly, the chauffeur looked round. "Monsieur," he stammered, and would have risen, but Briggerland laid his hand on his shoulder. "Do not rise, Francis," he said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I was hasty last night." "Monsieur, it was I who was hasty," said Morden huskily. "It was unpardonable." "Nonsense." Briggerland patted the man's shoulder. "What is that boat out there? A man of war, Francis?" Francis Morden turned his head toward the sea, and Briggerland pointed the ivory-handled pistol he had held behind his back, and shot him dead. The report of the revolver thrown down by the rocks came to Lydia like a clap of thunder. At first she thought it was a tire burst, and hurried up the steps to see. Mr. Briggerland was standing with his back to the car. At his feet was the tumbled body of Morden. "Mr. she gasped, and she saw the revolver in his hand. With a cry, she almost flung herself down the steps as the revolver exploded. The bullet ripped her hat from her head, and she flung up her hands, thinking she had been struck. Then the dark face showed over the parapet, and again the revolver was presented. She stared for a second into his benevolent eyes, and then something hit her violently, and she staggered back and dropped over the edge of the shelf, down, straight down into the sea below. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37. Probably Jean Briggerland never gave a more perfect representation of shocked surprise than when old Jaggs announced that he was Jack Glover. "Mr. Glover," she said incredulously. "If you will be kind enough to release my hands," said Jack savagely, "I will convince you." Jean, all meekness, obeyed, and presently he stood up with a groan. "You've nearly blinded me," he said, turning to the glass. "If I'd known it was you—" "Don't make me laugh," he snapped. "Of course you knew who it was." He took off the wig and peeled the beard from his face. "Was that very painful?" she asked sympathetically, and Jack snorted. "How was I to know it was you?" she demanded, virtuously indignant. "I thought you were a wicked old man." "You thought nothing of the sort, Miss Briggerland," said Jack. "You knew who I was, and you guessed why I had taken on this disguise. I was not many yards from you when it suddenly dawned upon you that I could not sleep at Lydia Meredith's flat unless I went there in the guise of an old man." "Why should you want to sleep at her flat at all?" she asked innocently. "It doesn't seem to me to be a very proper ambition." "That is an unnecessary question, and I'm wasting my time when I answer you," said Jack sternly. "I went there to save her life, to protect her against your murderous plots." "My murderous plots?" she repeated aghast. "You surely don't know what you're saying." "I know this," he said, and his face was not pleasant to see. "I have sufficient evidence to secure the arrest of your father, and possibly yourself. For months I have been working on that first providential accident of yours, the rich Australian who died with such remarkable suddenness. I may not get you in the Meredith case, and I may not be able to jail you for your attacks on Mrs. Meredith, but I have enough evidence to hang your father for the earlier crime." Her face was blank, expressionless. Never before had she been brought up short with such a threat as the man was uttering, nor had she ever been in danger of detection. And all the time she was eyeing him so steadily, not a muscle of her face moving. Her mind was groping back into the past, examining every detail of the crime he had mentioned, seeking for some flaw in the carefully prepared plan which had brought a good man to a violent and untimely end. "That kind of bluff doesn't impress me," she said at last.
You're in a poor way when you have to invent crimes to attach to me.
We'll go into that later. Where is Lydia? He said shortly.
I tell you, I don't know, except that she has gone out for a drive. I expect her back very soon.
Is your father with her? She shook her head.
No, Father went out early. I don't know who gave you authority to cross-examine me. Why, Jack Glover, you have all the importance of a French examining magistrate.
She smiled. You may learn how important they are soon, he said significantly. Where is your chauffeur, Morden?
He is gone, too. In fact, he is driving Lydia. Why?
She asked with a little tightening of heart. She had only just been in time, she thought, so they had associated Morden with the forgery. His first words confirmed this suspicion. There is a warrant for Morden, which will be executed as soon as he returns, said Jack. We have been able to trace him in London, and also the woman who presented the check. We know his movements from the time he left Nice by airplane for Paris to the time he returned to Nice. The people who changed the money for him will swear to his identity. If he expected to startle her, he was disappointed. She raised her eyebrows.
I can't believe it is possible. Morden was such an honest man, she said. We trusted him implicitly, and never once did he betray our trust. Now, Mr. Glover, she said coolly, might I suggest that an interview with a gentleman in my bedroom is not calculated to increase my servant's respect for me? Will you go downstairs and wait until I come?
You'll not attempt to leave this house? He said, and she laughed.
Really, you're going on like one of those infallible detectives one reads about in the popular magazines, she said, a little contemptuously. You have no authority whatever to keep me from leaving this house, and nobody knows that better than you. But you needn't be afraid. Sit on the stairs if you like, till I come down.
When he had gone, she rang the bell for her maid and handed her an envelope.
I shall be in the saloon talking to Mr. Glover, she said in a low voice. I want you to bring this in and say that you found it in the hall.
Yes, miss, said the woman. Jean proceeded leisurely to her toilet. In the struggle, her dress had been torn, and she changed it for a pale green silk gown. And Jack, pacing in the hall below, was on the point of coming up to discover if she had made her escape when she sailed serenely down the stairs. I should like to know one thing, Mr. Glover, she said as she went into the saloon. What do you intend on doing? What is your immediate plan? Are you going to spirit Lydia away from us? Of course, I know you're in love with her and all that sort of thing. His face went pink. I am not in love with Mrs. Meredith, he lied. Don't be silly, she said practically. Of course you're in love with her. My first job is to get that money back, and you are going to help me, he said. Of course I'm going to help you, she agreed. If Morden has been such a scoundrel, he must suffer the consequence. I'm sure that you're too clever to have made any mistake. Poor Morden! I wonder what made him do it, because he's such a good friend of Lydia's. And seriously, Mr. Glover, I do think that Lydia is being indiscreet. You made that remark before, he said quietly. Now perhaps you'll explain what you mean. She shrugged her shoulders. They are always about together. I saw them strolling on the lawn last night till quite a late hour, and I was so scared lest Mrs. Cole-Mortimer noticed it too. Which means that Mrs. Cole-Mortimer did not notice it. You're clever, Jean. Even as you invent, you make preparations to refute any evidence that the other side can produce. I don't believe a word you say. There was a knock at the door, and the maid entered bearing a letter on the salver. This was addressed to you, miss, she said. It was on the hall table. Didn't you see it? Why, no, said Jean in surprise. She took the letter, looked down at the address, and opened it. He saw a look of amazement and horror come to her face. Good God! Gasped Jean. What is it? He said, springing up. She stared at the letter again, and from the letter to him. Read it, she said, in a hollow voice. Dear Mademoiselle, I have returned from London and have confessed to Madame Meredith that I have forged her name and have drawn £100,000 from her bank. And now I have learnt that Madame Meredith loves me. There is only one end to this, that which you see. Jack read the letter twice. It is in his writing, too, he muttered. It's impossible, incredible. I tell you, I've had Mrs. Meredith under my eyes all the time she has been here. Is there a letter from her? He asked suddenly. But no, it is impossible, impossible. I haven't been into her room. Will you come up with me? He followed her up the stairs and into Lydia's big bedroom, and the first thing that caught his eye was a sealed letter on a table near the bed. He picked it up. It was addressed to him in Lydia's handwriting, and feverishly he tore it open. His face, when he had finished reading, was as white as hers had been. Where have they gone? He asked. They went to San Remo. By car? Of course. Without a word, he turned and ran down the stairs and out of the house. The taxi that had brought him in the role of Jaggs had gone, but down the road, a dozen yards away, was the car he had hired on the day he came to Monte Carlo. He gave instructions to the driver and jumped in. The car sped through Mentone, stopped only the briefest while at the customs barrier, whilst Jack pursued his inquiries. Yes, a lady had passed, but she had not returned. How long ago? Perhaps an hour, perhaps less. At top speed, the big car thundered along the sea road, twisting and turning, diving into valleys and climbing steep headlands, and then, rounding a corner, Jack saw the car and a little crowd about it. His heart turned to stone as he leaped to the road. He saw the backs of 2 Italian gendarmes, and, pushing aside the little knot of idlers, he came into the center of the group and stopped. Morden lay on his face in a pool of blood, and one of the policemen was holding an ivory-handled revolver. It was with this that the crime was committed, he said in fluent Italian. 3 of the chambers are empty. Now, at whom were the other 2 discharged? Jack reeled and gripped the mudguard of the car for support. Then his eyes strayed to the opening in the wall which ran on the seaward side of the road. He walked to the parapet and looked over, and the first thing he saw was a torn hat and a veil, and he knew it was Lydia's. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 and 39 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 38. Mr. Briggerland, killing time on the quay at Monaco, saw the Jungle Queen come into harbor and watched Marcus land, carrying his lines in his hand. As Marcus came abreast of him, he called, and Mr. Stepney looked round with a start. "Hello, Briggerland," he said, swallowing something. "Well, have you been fishing?" asked Mr. Briggerland in his most paternal manner. "Yes," admitted Marcus. "Did you catch anything?" Stepney nodded. "Only one," he said. "Hard luck," said Mr. Briggerland with a smile. "But where is Mrs. Meredith? I understood she was going out with you today." "She went to San Remo," said Stepney shortly, and the other nodded. "To be sure," he said. "I had forgotten that." Later, he bought a copy of the Nicoise and learned of the tragedy on the San Remo road. It brought him back to the house, a visibly agitated man. "This is shocking news, my dear." He panted into the saloon and stood stock still at the sight of Mr. Jack Glover. "Come in, Briggerland," said Jack without ceremony. There was a man with him, a tall, keen Frenchman, whom Briggerland recognized as the chief detective of the prefecture. "We want you to give an account of your actions." "My actions?" said Mr. Briggerland indignantly. "Do you associate me with this dreadful tragedy?" "A tragedy," he said, "which has stricken me almost dumb with horror and remorse. Why did I ever allow that villain to even speak to poor Lydia?" "Nevertheless, monsieur," said the tall man quietly, "you must tell us where you have been." "That is easily explained. I went to San Remo." "By road?" "Yes, by road," said Mr. Briggerland, "on my motor bicycle." "What time did you arrive in San Remo?" "At midday, or it may have been a quarter of an hour before." "You know that the murder must have been committed at 11:30, said Jack. "So the newspapers tell me." "Where did you go in San Remo?" asked the detective. "I went to a cafe and had a glass of wine. Then I strolled about the town and lunched at the Victoria. I caught the 1 o'clock train to Monte Carlo." "Did you hear nothing of the murder?" "Not a word," said Mr. Briggerland. "Not a word." "Did you see the car?" Mr. Briggerland shook his head. "I left some time before poor Lydia," he said softly. "Did you know of any attachment between the chauffeur and your guest?" "I had no idea such thing existed. If I had," said Mr. Briggerland virtuously, "I should have taken immediate steps to have brought poor Lydia to her senses." "Your daughter says they were frequently together. Did you notice this?" "Yes, I did notice it, but my daughter and I are very democratic. We have made a friend of Morden, and I suppose what would have seemed familiar to you would pass unnoticed with us. Yes, I certainly do remember my poor friend and Morden walking together in the garden." "Is this yours?" The detective took from behind a curtain an old British rifle. "Yes, that is mine," admitted Briggerland without a moment's hesitation. "It is one I bought in Amiens, a souvenir of our gallant soldiers." "I know. I quite understand your patriotic motive in purchasing it," said the detective dryly. "But will you tell us how this passed from your possession?" "I haven't the slightest notion," said Mr. Briggerland in surprise. "I had no idea it was lost. I had lost sight of it for some weeks. Can it be that Morden? But no, I must not think so evilly of him." "What were you going to suggest?" asked Jack. "That Morden fired at Mrs. Meredith when she was on the swimming raft? If you are, I can save you the trouble of telling that lie. It was you who fired, and it was I who knocked you out." Mr. Briggerland's face was a study. "I can't understand why you make such wild and unfounded charge," he said gently. "Perhaps, my dear, you could elucidate this mystery?" Jean had not spoken since he had entered. She sat bolt upright on a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her sad eyes fixed, now upon Jack, now upon the detective. She shook her head. "I know nothing about the rifle, and I didn't even know you possessed one," she said. "But please answer all their questions, Father. I'm as anxious as you are to get to the bottom of this dreadful tragedy. Have you told my father about the letters which were discovered?" The detective shook his head. "I have not seen your father until he arrived at this moment," he said. "Letters?" Mr. Briggerland looked at his daughter. "Did poor Lydia leave a letter?" She nodded. "I think Mr. Glover will tell you, Father," she said. "Poor Lydia had an attachment for Morden. It is very clear what happened. They went out today, never intending to return." "Mrs. Meredith had no intention of going to the Lovers' Chair until you suggested the trip to her," said Jack quietly. "Mrs. Cole Mortimer is very emphatic on that point." "Has the body been found?" asked Mr. Briggerland. "Nothing has been found but the chauffeur," said the detective. After a few more questions, He took Jack outside. "It looks very much to me as though it was one of those crimes of passion which are so frequent in this country," he said. "Morden was a Frenchman, and I have been able to identify him by tattoo marks on his arm as a man who has been in the hands of the police many times." "You think there is no hope?" The detective shrugged his shoulders. "We are dragging the pool. There is very deep water under the rock, but the chances are that the body has been washed out to sea. There is clearly no evidence against these people, except yours. The letters might, of course, have been forged, but you say you are certain that the writing is Mrs. Meredith's." Jack nodded. They were walking down the road towards the officer's waiting car when Jack asked, "May I see that letter again?" The detective took it from his pocketbook, and Jack stopped and scanned it. "Yes, it is her writing," he said, and then uttered an exclamation. "Do you see that?" He pointed eagerly to two little marks before the words "Dear Friend." "Quotation marks," said the detective, puzzled. "Why did she write that?" "I've got it," said Jack. "The story. Mademoiselle Briggerland told me she was writing a story, and I remember she said she had had writer's cramp. Suppose she dictated a portion of the story to Mrs. Meredith, and suppose that in that story there occurred this letter. Lydia would have put quotation marks mechanically." The detective took the letter from his hand. "It is possible," he said. "The writing is very even. It shows no sign of agitation, and of course the character's initials might be L.M. It is an ingenious hypothesis, and not wholly improbable. But if this were a part of the story, there would be other sheets. Would you like me to search the house?" Jack shook his head. "She's much too clever to have them in the house," he said. "More likely she's put them in the fire." "What fire?" asked the detective dryly. "These houses have no fires. They're central heated. Unless she went to the kitchen." "Which she wouldn't do," said Jack thoughtfully. "No, she'd burn them in the garden." The detective nodded, and they returned to the house. Jean, deep in conversation with her father, saw them reappear, and watched them as they walked slowly across the lawn toward the trees, their eyes fixed on the ground. "What are they looking for?" she asked with a frown. "I'll go and see," said Briggerland, but she caught his arm. "Do you think they'll tell you?" she asked sarcastically. She ran up to her own room and watched them from behind a curtain. Presently they passed out of sight to the other side of the house, and she went into Lydia's room and overlooked them from there. Suddenly she saw the detective stoop and pick up something from the ground, and her teeth set. "The burnt story," she said. "I never dreamt they'd look for that." It was only a scrap they found, but it was in Lydia's writing, and the pencil mark was clearly visible on the charred ashes. "Laura Martin," read the detective. "L.M. And there are the words tragic and remorse." From the remainder of the charred fragments they collected nothing of importance. Jean watched them disappear along the avenue and went down to her father. "I had a fright," she said. "You look as if you still got it," he said. He eyed her keenly. She shook her head. "Father, you must understand that this adventure may end disastrously. There are 99 chances against the truth being known, but it is the extra chance that is worrying me. We ought to have settled Lydia more quietly, more naturally. There was too much melodrama and shooting, but I don't see how we could have done anything else. Morden was very tiresome." "Where did Glover come from?" asked Briggerland. "He's been here all the time," said the girl. "What?" She nodded. "He was old Jaggs. I had an idea he was, but I was certain when I remembered that he had stayed at Lydia's flat." He put down his teacup and wiped his lips with a silk handkerchief. "I wish this business was over," he said fretfully. "It looks as if we shall have trouble."
"Of course we shall," she said coldly. "You didn't expect to get a fortune of £600,000 without trouble, did you? I dare say we shall be suspected, but it takes a lot of suspicion to worry me. We'll be in calm water soon, for the rest of our lives."
"I hope so," he said, without any great conviction. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was prostrate and in bed, and Jean had no patience to see her. She herself ordered the dinner, and they had finished when a visitor in the shape of Mr. Marcus Stepney came in. It was unusual of Marcus to appear at the dinner hour, except in evening dress, and she remarked the fact wonderingly. "Can I have a word with you, Jean?" he asked.
"What is it? What is it?" asked Mr. Briggerland testily. "Haven't we had enough mysteries?"
Marcus eyed him without favor. "We'll have another one, if you don't mind," he said unpleasantly, and the girl, whose every sense was alert, picked up a wrap and walked into the garden, with Marcus following on her heels. 10 minutes passed, and they did not return. A quarter of an hour went by, and Mr. Briggerland grew uneasy. He got up from his chair, put down his book, and was halfway across the room when the door opened and Jack Glover came in, followed by the detective. It was the Frenchman who spoke. "Monsieur Briggerland, I have a warrant from the prefect of the Alpes Maritimes for your arrest."
My arrest?"
spluttered the dark man, his teeth chattering.
What is the charge?"
"The wilful murder of Francis Mordaunt," said the officer.
You lie!"
screamed Briggerland.
"I have no knowledge of any—"
His words sank into a throaty gurgle, and he stared past the detective. Lydia Meredith was standing in the doorway. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39. The morning for Mr. Stepney had been doubly disappointing. Again and again he drew up an empty line, and at last he flung the tackle into the well of the launch. "Even the damn fish won't bite," he said, and the humor of his remark cheered him. He was 10 miles from the shore, and the blue coast was a dim, ragged line on the horizon. He pulled out a big luncheon basket from the cabin and eyed it with disfavor. It had cost him 200 francs. He opened the basket, and at the sight of its contents was inclined to reconsider his earlier view that he had wasted his money. The more so, since the waiter at the hotel had thoughtfully included 2-quart bottles of champagne. Mr. Marcus Stepney made a hearty meal, and by the time he had dropped an empty bottle into the sea, he was inclined to take a more cheerful view of life. He threw over the debris of the lunch, pushed the basket under one of the seats of the cabin, pulled up his anchor, and started the engines running. The sky was a brighter blue, and the sea held a finer sparkle, and he was inclined to take a view of even Jean Briggerland, more generous than any he had held. "Little devil!" He smiled reminiscently as he murmured the words. He opened the second bottle of champagne in her honor. Mr. Marcus Stepney was usually an abstemious man, and drank solemnly, if not soberly, to her health and happiness. As the sun grew warmer, he began to feel an uncountable sleepiness. He was sober enough to know that to fall asleep in the middle of the ocean was to ask for trouble, and he set the bow of the Jungle Queen for the nearest beach, hoping to find a landing place. He found something better as he skirted the shore. The sea and the weather had scooped out a big hollow under a high cliff, a hollow just big enough to take the Jungle Queen, and deep and still enough to ensure her a safe anchorage. A rock barrier interposed between the breakers and this deep pool which the waves had hollowed in the stony floor of the ocean. As he dropped his anchor, he disturbed a school of fish, and his angling instincts reawoke. He let down his line over the side, seated himself comfortable in one of the 2 big basket chairs, and was dozing comfortably. It was the sound of a shot that woke him. It was followed by another, and a third. Almost immediately something dropped from the cliff and fell with a mighty splash into the water. Marcus was wide awake now and almost sobered. He peered down into the clear depths and saw a figure of a woman turning over and over. Then, as it floated upwards, it came on its back, and he saw the face. Without a moment's hesitation, he dived into the water. He would have been wiser if he had waited until she floated to the surface, for now he found a difficulty in regaining the boat. After a great deal of trouble, he managed to reach into the launch and pull out a rope, which he fastened round the girl's waist and drew tight to a small stanchion. Then he climbed into the boat himself and pulled her after him. He thought at first she was dead, but listening intently, he heard the beating of her heart and searched the luncheon basket for a small flask of liqueurs, which Alphonse, the head waiter, had packed. He put the bottle to her lips and poured a small quantity into her mouth. She choked convulsively and presently opened her eyes. "You're amongst friends," said Marcus unnecessarily. She sat up and covered her face with her hands. It all came back to her in a flash, and the horror of it froze her blood. "What has happened to you?" asked Marcus. "I don't know exactly," she said faintly. And then, "Oh, it was dreadful, dreadful." Marcus Stepney offered her the flask of liqueurs, and when she shook her head, he helped himself liberally. Lydia was conscious of a pain in her left shoulder. The sleeve was torn, and across the thick of the arm there was an ugly, raw weal. "It looks like a bullet mark to me," said Marcus Stepney, suddenly grave. "I heard a shot. Did somebody shoot at you?" She nodded. "Who?" She tried to frame the word, but no sound came, and then she burst into a fit of weeping. "Not Jean?" he asked hoarsely. She shook her head. "Briggerland?" She nodded. "Briggerland!" Mr. Stepney whistled, and as he whistled he shivered. "Let's get out of here," he said. "We shall catch our death of cold. The sun will warm us up." He started the engines going and safely navigated the narrow passage to the open sea. He had to get a long way out before he could catch a glimpse of the road. Then he saw the car and a cycling policeman dismounting and bending over something. He put away his telescope and turned to the girl. "This is bad, Mrs. Meredith," he said. "Thank God I wasn't in it." "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "I'm taking you out to sea," said Marcus with a little smile. "Don't get scared, Mrs. Meredith. I want to hear that story of yours. And if it is anything like what I fear, then it would be better for you that Briggerland thinks you are dead." She told the story as far as she knew it, and he listened, not interrupting, until she had finished. "More than dead, eh? That's bad. But how on earth are they going to explain it? I suppose," he said with a smile, "you didn't write a letter saying you were going to run away with the chauffeur?" She sat up to this. "I did write a letter," she said slowly. "It wasn't a real letter. It was in a story which Jean was dictating." She closed her eyes. "How awful! I can't believe it, even now." "Tell me about the story," said the man quickly. "It was a story she was writing for a London magazine, and her wrist hurt, so I wrote it down as she dictated. Only about 3 pages, but one of the pages was a letter supposed to have been written by the heroine saying she was going away, as she loved somebody who was beneath her socially." "Good God!" said Marcus, genuinely shocked. "Did Jean do that?" He seemed absolutely crushed by the realization of Jean Briggerland's deed, and he did not speak again for a long time. "I'm glad I know," he said. "Do you really think that all this time she has been trying to kill me?" He nodded. "She has used everybody," Even me," he said bitterly. "I don't want you to think badly of me, Mrs. Meredith, but I'm going to tell you the truth. I'd provisioned this little yacht today for a 1,200-mile trip, and you were to be my companion." "I?" she said incredulously. "It was Jean's idea, really, though I think she must have altered her view, or thought I'd forgotten all she suggested. I intended taking you out to sea and keeping you out there until you agreed." He shook his head. "I don't think I could have done it, really," he said, speaking half to himself. "I'm not really built for a conspirator. None of that rough stuff ever appealed to me. Well, I didn't try anyway." "No, Mr. Stepney," she said quietly, "and I don't think, if you had, you would have succeeded." He was in his frankest mood, and startled her later when he told her of his profession, without attempting to excuse or minimize the method by which he earned his livelihood. "I was in a pretty bad way, and I thought there was easy money coming, and that rather tempted me," he said. "I know you will think I'm a despicable cod, but you can't think too badly of me, really." He surveyed the shore. Ahead of them, the green tongue of Cap Martin jutted out into the sea. "I'll take you to Nice," he said. "We'll attract less attention there, and I'll probably be able to get in touch with your old Mr. Jaggs. You've no idea where I can find him? At any rate, I can go to the Villa Casa and discover what sort of yarn is being told." "And probably I can get my clothes dry," she said with a little grimace. "I wonder if you know how uncomfortable I am." "Pretty well," he said calmly. "Every time I move, a new stream of water runs down my back." It was 3:30 in the afternoon when they reached Nice, and Marcus saw the girl safely to a hotel, changed himself, and brought the yacht back to Monaco, where Briggerland had seen him. For 2 hours Marcus Stepney wrestled with his love for a girl who was plainly a murderess, and in the end love won. When darkness fell, he provisioned the Jungle Queen, loaded her with petrol, and heading her out to sea, made the swimming cove of Cap Martin. It was to the boat that Jean flew. "What about my father?" she asked as she stepped aboard. "I think they've caught him," said Marcus. "He'll hate prison," said the girl complacently. "Hurry, Marcus. I'd hate it too." End of chapter 39. Chapters 40 and 41 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 40. Lydia took up her quarters in a quiet hotel in Nice, and Mrs. Cole Mortimer agreed to stay on and chaperone her. Though she had felt no effects from her terrifying experience on the first day, she found herself a nervous wreck when she awoke in the morning and wisely decided to stay in bed. Jack, who had expected the relapse, called in a doctor, but Lydia refused to see him. The next day she received the lawyer. She had only briefly outlined the part which Marcus Stepney had played in her rescue, but she had said enough to make Jack call at Stepney's hotel to thank him in person. Mr. Stepney, however, was not at home. He had not been home all night, but this information his discreet informant did not volunteer. Nor was the disappearance of the Jungle Queen noticed for 2 days. It was Mrs. Cole Mortimer, in settling up her accounts with Jack, who mentioned the yacht. "The Jungle Queen," said Jack. "That's the motor launch, isn't it? I've seen her lying in the harbor. I thought she was Stepney's property." His suspicions aroused, he called again at Stepney's hotel, and this time his inquiry was backed by the presence of a detective. Then it was made known that Mr. Stepney had not been seen since the night of Briggerland's arrest. "That is where they've gone. Stepney was very keen on the girl, I think," said Jack. The detective was annoyed. "If I'd known before, we could have intercepted them. We have several destroyers in the harbor at Villafrance. Now I'm afraid it's too late." Where would they make for? Asked Jack. The officer shrugged his shoulders. God knows, he said. They could get into Italy or into Spain, possibly Barcelona. I will telegraph the chief of the police there. But the Barcelona police had no information to give. The Jungle Queen had not been sighted. The weather was calm, the sea was smooth, and everything favorable for the escape. Inquiries elicited the fact that Mr. Stepney had bought large quantities of petrol a few days before his departure, and had augmented his supply the evening he had left. Also, he had brought provisions in considerable quantities. The murder was a week old, and Mr. Briggerland had undergone his preliminary examination when a wire came through from the Spanish police that a motorboat answering the description of the Jungle Queen had called at Malaga, had provisioned, refilled, and put out to sea again before the police authorities, who had a description of the pair, had time to investigate. "You'll think I have a diseased mind," said Lydia, "but I hope she gets away." Jack laughed. "If you had been with her much longer, Lydia, she would have turned you into a first-class criminal," he said. "I hope you do not forget that she has exactly 100,000 pounds of yours, in other words, a sixth of your fortune." Lydia shook her head. "That is almost a comforting thought," she said. "I know she is what she is, Jack, but her greatest crime is that she was born 600 years too late. If she had lived in the days of the Italian Renaissance, she would have made history." "Your sympathy is immoral," said Jack. "By the way, Briggerland has been handed over to the Italian authorities. The crime was committed on Italian soil, and that saves his head from falling into the basket." She shuddered. "What will they do to him?" "He'll be in prison for life," was the reply. "And I rather think that's a little worse than the guillotine. You say you worry for Jean. I'm rather sorry for the old man Briggerland. If he hadn't tried to live up to his daughter, he might have been a more respectable member of society." They were strolling through the quaint, narrow streets of Grasse, and Jack, who knew and loved the town, was showing her sights which made her forget that the perfumery factory, the Mecca of the average tourist, had any existence. "I suppose I'll have to settle down now," she said with an expression of distaste. "I suppose you will," said Jack, "and you'll have to settle up, too. Your legal expenses are something fierce." "Why do you say that?" she asked, stopping in her walk and looking at him gravely. "I am speaking as your mercenary lawyer." "You were trying to put your service on another level," she corrected. "I owe everything I have to you. My fortune is the least of these. I owe you my life 3 times over." "4," he corrected, "and to Marcus Stepney once." "Why have you done so much for me? Were you interested?" she asked after a pause. "Very," he replied. "I was interested in you from the moment I saw you step out of Mr. Morden's taxi into the mud. But I was especially interested in you—" "When?" she asked. "When I sat outside your door, night after night, and discovered you didn't snore," he said shamelessly, and she went red. "I hope you'll never refer to your old Jag's adventures. It was very—" "What?" "I was going to say horrid, but I shouldn't be telling the truth," she admitted frankly. "I liked having you there. Poor Mrs. Morgan will be disconsolate when she discovers we've lost our lodger." They walked into the cool of the ancient cathedral and sat down. "There's something very soothing about a church, isn't there?" he whispered. "Look at that gorgeous window. If I were ever rich enough to marry the woman I loved, I should be married in a cathedral like this, full of old tombs and statues and stained glass." "How rich would you have to be?" she asked. "As rich as she is." She bent over toward him, her lips against his ear.
Tell me how much money you have, she whispered, and I'll give away all I have in excess of that amount. He caught her hand and held it fast, and they sat there before the altar of St. Catherine until the sun went down and the disapproving old woman, who acted as the cathedral's caretaker, tapped them on the shoulder. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41. "That is Gibraltar," said Marcus Stepney, pointing ahead to a gray shape that loomed up from the sea. He was unshaven, for he had forgotten to bring his razor, and he was pinched with the cold. His overcoat was turned up to his ears, in spite of which he shivered. Jean did not seem to be affected by the sudden change of temperature. She sat on top of the cabin, her chin in the palm of her hand, her elbow on her crossed knee. "You are not going into Gibraltar?" she asked. He shook his head. "I think not," he said. "Did you see that fellow on the quay yelling for the craft to come back after we left Malaga? That was a bad sign. I expect the police have instructions to detain this boat, and most of the ports must have been notified." "How long can we run?" "We've got enough gas and grub to reach Dhaka," he said. "That's roughly an 8 days' journey." "On the African coast?" He nodded, although she could not see him. "Where could we get a ship to take us to South America?" she asked, turning round. "Lisbon," he said thoughtfully. "Yes, we could reach Lisbon, but there are too many steamers about, and we're certain to be sighted. We might run across to Las Palmas. Most of the South American boats call there. But if I were you, I should stick to Europe. Come and take this helm, Jean." She obeyed without question, and he continued the work, which had been interrupted by a late meal, the painting of the boat's hull, a difficult business, involving acrobatics, since it was necessary for him to lean over the side. He had bought the gray paint at Malaga, and, happily, there was not much surface that required attention. The stumpy mast of the Jungle Queen had already gone overboard. He had sawn it off with great labor the day after they had left Cap Martin. She watched him with a speculative eye as he worked, and thought he had never looked quite so unattractive as he did with an 8 days' growth of beard, his shirt stained with paint and petrol, his hands were grimy, and nobody would have recognized in this scarecrow the elegant habitué of those fashionable resorts which smart society frequents. Yet she had reason to be grateful to him. His conduct toward her had been irreproachable. Not one word of love had been spoken, nor until now had their future plans, for it affected them both, been discussed. "Suppose we reach South America safely?" she asked. "What happens then, Marcus?" He looked round from his work in surprise. "We'll get married," he said quietly, and she laughed. "And what happens to the present Mrs. Stepney?" "She has divorced me," said Stepney unexpectedly. "I got the papers the day we left." "I see," said Jean softly. "We'll get married." Then stopped. He looked at her and frowned. "Isn't that your idea, too?" he asked. "Married? Yes, that's my idea, too. It seems a queer, uninteresting way of finishing things, doesn't it? And yet, I suppose it isn't." He had resumed his work, and was leaning far over the bow, intent upon his labor. Suddenly, she spun the wheel round, and the launch heeled over to starboard. For a second, it seemed that Marcus Stepney could not maintain his balance against that unexpected impetus, but by a superhuman effort he kicked himself back to safety, and stared at her with a blanched face. "Why did you do that?" he asked hoarsely. "You nearly had me overboard." "There was a porpoise lying on the surface of the sea asleep, I think," she said quietly. "I'm very sorry, Marcus, but I didn't know it would throw you off your balance." He looked round for the sleeping fish, but it had disappeared. "You told me to avoid them, you know," she said apologetically. "Did I really put you in any danger?" He licked his dry lips,
picked up the paint pot, and threw it into the sea. "We'll leave this," he said, "until we are beached. You gave me a scare, Jean."
"I'm dreadfully sorry. Come here and sit by me."
She moved to allow him room, and he sat down by her, taking the wheel from her hand. On the horizon, the high lands of northern Africa were showing their saw-edged outlines. "That is Morocco," he pointed out to her. "I propose giving Gibraltar a wide berth and following the coastline to Tangier." "Tangier wouldn't be a bad place to land if there weren't two of us," he went on. "It is our being together in this yacht that is likely to cause suspicion. You could easily pretend that you'd come over from Gibraltar, and the port authorities, they are pretty slack." "Or, if we could land on the coast," he suggested. "There's a good landing, and we could follow the beach down and turn up in Tangier in the morning. All sorts of oddments turn up in Tangier without exciting suspicion." She was looking out over the sea with a queer expression on her face.
"Morocco," she said softly. "Morocco. I hadn't thought of that."
They had a fright soon after. A gray shape came racing out of the darkening east, and Stepney put his helm over as the destroyer smashed past on her way to Gibraltar. He watched the stern light disappearing, then suddenly turned and presented its side to them. "They're looking for us," said Marcus. The darkness had come down, and he headed straight for the east. There was no question that the destroyer was on an errand of discovery. A white beam of light shot out from her decks and began to feel along the sea. And then, when they thought it had missed them, it dropped on the boat and held. A second later, it missed them and began a search. Presently, it lit the little boat, and it did something more. It revealed a thickening of the atmosphere. They were running into a sea fog, one of those thin white fogs that come down in the Mediterranean on windless days. The blinding glare of the searchlight blurred. Bang! "That's the gun to signal us to stop," said Marcus between his teeth. He turned the nose of the boat southward, a hazardous proceeding, for he ran into clear water, and had only just got back to the shelter of the providential fog bank when the white beam came stealthily along the edge of the mist. Presently it died out, and they saw it no more. "They are looking for us," said Marcus again.
"You said that before," said the girl calmly.
"They've probably warned them at Tangier. We dare not take the boat into the bay," said Stepney, whose nerves were now on edge. He turned again westward, edging toward the rocky coast of northern Africa. They saw little clusters of lights on the shore, and he tried to remember what towns they were. "I think that big one is Cutra, the Spanish convict station," he said. He slowed down the boat, and they felt their way gingerly along the coastline until the flick and flash of a lighthouse gave them an idea of their position. "Cape Spartel," he identified the light. "We can land very soon. I was in Morocco for 3 months, and if I remember rightly, the beach is good walking as far as Tangier." She went into the cabin and changed, and as the nose of the Jungle Queen slid gently up the sandy beach, she was ready. He carried her ashore and set her down. Then he pushed off the nose of the boat and maneuvered it so that the stern was against the beach, resting in 3 feet of water. He jumped on board, lashed the helm, and started the engines going. Then, wading back to the shore, he stood staring into the gloom as the little Jungle Queen put out to sea. "That's that," he said grimly. "Now, my dear, we've got a 10-mile walk before us." But he had made a slight miscalculation. The distance between himself and Tangier was 25 miles, and involved several detours inland to a country which was wholly uninhabited, save at that moment it held the camp of Muley Hafiz, who was engaged in negotiation with the Spanish government for one of those permanent peaces which frequently lasted for years. Muley Hafiz sat drinking his coffee at midnight, listening to the strains of an ornate gramophone, which stood in a corner of his square tent. A voice outside the silken fold of his tent greeted him, and he stopped the machine. "What is it?" he asked. "Lord, we have captured a man and woman walking along by the sea." "They are reefy people. Let them go," said Muley in Arabic. "We are making peace, my man, not war." "Lord, these are infidels. I think they are English." Muley Hafiz twisted his trim little beard. "Bring them," he said. So they were brought into his presence, a disheveled man and a girl at the sight of whose face he gasped. "My little friend of the Riviera," he said wonderingly, and the smile she gave him was like a ray of sunshine to his heart. He stood up, a magnificent figure of a man, and she eyed him admiringly. "I am sorry if my men have frightened you," he said. "You have nothing to fear, madame. I will send my soldiers to escort you to Tangier." And then he frowned. "Where did you come from?" She could not lie under the steady glance of those liquid eyes. "We landed on the shore from a boat. We lost our way," she said. He nodded. "You must be the she they are seeking," he said. "One of my spies came to me from Tangier tonight and told me that the Spanish and the French police were waiting to arrest a lady who had committed some crime in France. I cannot believe it is you, or if it is, then I should say the crime was pardonable." He glanced at Marcus. "Or perhaps," he said slowly, "it is your companion they desire?" Jean shook her head. "No, they do not want him," she said. "It is I they want." He pointed to a cushion. "Sit down," he said, and followed her example. Marcus alone remained standing, wondering how this strange situation would develop. "What will you do? If you go into Tangier, I fear I could not protect you. But there is a city in the hills." He waved his hand. "Many miles from here. A city where the hills are green, mademoiselle, and where beautiful springs gush out of the ground. And there I am lord." She drew a long breath. "I will go to the city of the hills," she said softly. "And this man," she shrugged her shoulders, "I do not care what happens to him," she said, with a smile of amusement at the pallid Marcus. "Then he shall go to Tangier alone." But Marcus Stepney did not go alone. For the last 2 miles of the journey, he had carried a bag containing the greater part of 5,000,000 francs that the girl had brought from the boat. Jean did not remember this until she was on her way to the city of the hills, and by that time, money did not interest her. End of chapter 41. And end of The Angel of Terror. This has been a LibriVox recording read by Allison Hester in January 2008.